So how do you quit your job with passive income? And is that even possible? Well, today I've got Jeremy Roll, who has been able to do just that, quit his job with passive income and become a full-time passive investor, which is what I think we all should aspire to. So Jeremy, welcome. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me here, Bronson. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's really great to have you. I know we know each other. We've known each other for a while through the local meetups that we do, Phoebe in Southern California. So I've appreciated your involvement with that. But you were able to quit your corporate job by passive investing. Can you talk to us a little bit about that story and kind of how you got there?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So my story goes quite a way back at this point because we're recording this in 2021 and that happened in 2007. The truth of the matter is that I think a lot of people assume that I had a strategy and a whole plan to kind of get out of the corporate world with cash flow. In fact, when I set off my cash flow strategy, it was really how do I get more predictability for my retirement account while also keep a paycheck. So having the W-2 paycheck and the cash flow. This was after the dot-com crash back in 2002 is when I started. And I just wanted to get away from the lack of predictability and the volatility of the stock market. And I kind of decided that the best strategy for me was to focus more on cash flow. And so I essentially rotated all my savings and retirement from stocks and bonds to cash flow between 02 and 07. And then I honestly had a last straw moment in the corporate world with my manager at the time. I was actually working at Toyota headquarters here in Los Angeles. And I decided to take a risk and leave the corporate world because I had the cash flow built up. I didn't do it the other way around. I didn't like, okay, here's the plan. Oh, I got to my goal. I'm going to leave the corporate world. I have to tell you, I've spoken to many people over the years who have actually created a plan for themselves and gotten out of the corporate world like you're talking about. Mine was, I wouldn't call it accidental by any means, but it wasn't planned, that's for sure.
Well, it's really interesting, Jeremy. A lot of people wonder, and you see people do this, they literally burn the boats and they decide they're going to go into real estate and they quit their job and they go into some sort of investing and they have no income and they even go into debt and they do crazy things and people do it. And some people it works out for them. Other people are like, they wait until they're like a few days before retirement or something and they've got this stream in, and there's kind of everywhere in between. So I was kind of in the middle. So I had, passive, I was planning to leave before COVID. And yet I held on a little longer, was able to kind of continue to do some more deals, which really helped a lot. But it's interesting, how passive investing works. But why don't you talk to us a little bit about passive investing? Some people think that passive investing is really kind of a myth, that there's really nothing, there's no such thing as passive investing, right? So you talked about how passive investing really works.
Sure, absolutely. So the definition of passive investing, I'll start with that, is a little bit it varies by person, so I don't think it's so set in concrete. The way I define passive investing myself is lack of control. So if you have control, then to me it's active. If you don't have control, it's passive. And let me just kind of give you an example where I think maybe people think something is passive when I call it active. So if you were to buy a single family home and then have a property manager and have that property manager oversee that home, and it could even be in another state, you may have never even seen it, right? Some people will consider that passive. I consider it active. The reason why I consider it active is because someone may call me and say, look, the toilet broke. Can I have your approval to fix this toilet for this amount of money, right? Or so-and-so has to be fixed, or so-and-so needs to be redone, or whatever it is. You have control over refinancing the property, financing the property, selling the property. You get to choose if you approve the tenant or not, all that stuff. To me, once you're making those decisions, you have control. That I consider that active, even though some people would consider it passive, right? To me, truly passive when someone else is managing the opportunity on your behalf and you're investing and making a bet on that person to oversee the whole thing. And then from a cash flow perspective, normally I'm getting quarterly cash flow checks if things go right. Sometimes it's monthly, but most of the times it's quarterly. So yeah, so to me, that's a very important distinction, I think, between passive and active, just for people to even understand. And it's absolutely possible in that, to me, I focus mostly on what's called syndications, which are essentially a concept of someone buying, let's say, a building or some property. They're pooling a whole bunch of investors together, and they call it, they're syndicating out their opportunities. They're trying to find investors, and the concept is they're going to take many investors and pull them together. And then once you're one of those many investors, you have a very small vote. Most of the items in the day-to-day control are left to the actual control of the sponsor or the operator, and therefore it's truly passive. Your job is all up front in finding and vetting the opportunity, vetting the person you're making a bet on, and then as soon as you send them your paperwork and money to subscribe to that opportunity, literally it's all passive after that. I mean, you're getting a quarterly report and a quarterly check, or monthly report and a monthly check, but there is such thing as truly passive. I also want to say, I think maybe a lot of the younger audience out there, because I have a younger son, may hear about, like, say Amazon, becoming an Amazon retailer and all these programs you could buy for passive cash flow. To me, again, that's active because you still have control over that. You're responsible for certain decision making on inventory, replenishment inventory, all these different things. And it may not take very many hours, but that's still active. And I think a lot of people think there's no such thing as passive because they hear about those things when you're actually doing work in them, right? In the reality, there actually are some things you could do where there is no work involved.
Right. No, it's a really, really good distinction you bring up, because a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to get into real estate and I'm going to become financially free. And a lot of people watching this video or listening to this may say, hey, I want to quit my job, and how do I do it? And a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to do it through single family investing. And I've just met very few people that are able to do it. It's a very long-term play. It's more of an appreciation play. There's typically very little cash flow. And the challenge is, once you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 houses or duplexes or units, it gets to be really hard to manage. And you think it's not that much, but getting those calls and, hey, what do we do in this situation, or what's happening here? It actually is fairly active. So the idea of passive investing, I love what you said, is that you maybe you don't have control, but it basically, your work is on the front end. So you're vetting the deal, you're vetting the sponsor, and then when you feel comfortable, you decide to invest. And so my thought is, whether people are active in real estate or other types of investments, we should all aspire to become more passive, because then we actually get control over our time. And I know that's something that you've been able to do very, very well. So talk to us a little bit about the types of investments that you've invested in. I think one time, we had an interview previously for one of our meetups, and you'd invested in like 40 different types of investments of all different kinds. There was some master list, but can you talk to us just about maybe some of the major ones people should be aware of when it comes to passive investing?
Yeah, I'm currently in over 60 LLCs right now. And just to give you I was in 40 sales probably in the last 3 to 4 years alone. So yeah, but then again, you have to understand, first of all, I'm not a financial advisor and investment advisor, so I think I'm sharing just my perspective as an investor, but I don't recommend to anybody that they try to achieve 60 different things. I do it full time. It happens over the course of many years. I've been doing this 20 years. I've been in some things over 10 years, some things less than a year, right? So it's just because I've been doing it for so long, right? And so I'm currently in a lot of different, all kinds of different things. I'll give you a very quick list, and I'll try to keep it reasonable, but apartments, student housing apartments, mobile home parks, self-storage, RV parks, office, industrial, retail, enclosed mall, retail strip center. I'm in single family lending for flippers. I am in ATM cash flowing investments, oil and gas, some debt related stuff, some accounts receivable stuff from, attorney clients, like just all kinds of stuff. It kind of goes on and on. And I'm also in a handful of startups, which is not what we're talking about today, but it's like 1% of what I do, right? I'm in about 10 startups. And so my whole thing is, I love diversification. I actually love diversification across asset classes, geographies, and operators. And I think there's a point at which diversification is overdone. I've probably overdone it, but in the end of the day, I just love the fact that I'm highly, highly diversified. And frankly, the pandemic that we're still going through and that we've been through now for a couple of years is a really great example of when that diversification is so key.
Right. It's a really interesting conversation. Again, I used to be an investment advisor. I'm not an investment advisor or giving anybody any investment advice. This is simply educational and informational. So obviously consult your professional. But the question comes up sometimes when I work with investors in deals. They're like, well, how much should I put into a deal? If my net worth is 5 million, how much should I put in? Warren Buffett, basically, he kind of says something like this. He's like, if you're fully invested in 6 different stocks or 6 different investments, you actually have a pretty good level of diversification. But I know you've got 60 going. So you've got a lot going. And I know diversity, it does provide you a lot because you asset classes and geographies and stuff like that. But you basically have 10 times the amount of work to track all this stuff, right? So
yes.
Obviously you're not giving anybody any advice, but you said, so what would you say the ideal number of deals to be in would be if someone is, let's say if somebody's a professional and they're working and they're trying to do this part-time to ramp up their income? And
the most common target goal that I've talked to a lot of investors, talked to thousands over the years, easy. And the most common target goal that I see people trying to achieve, especially if they're working, is between 10 and 20 total investments. So having no more than 5 to 10% of the amount you're going to invest on these types of opportunities in one thing, right? Because most people have, I don't have stocks and bonds, and most people will have stocks and bonds and other things. And so they're only gonna have a portion of their pie or one slice of their pie dedicated toward these type of opportunities, these cash flowing opportunities. And of that, I would say that the most common is diversify across 10 or 20. Me being a pretty low risk guy, I like the idea of 20. I love the idea that if one of them just crashes and burns, you've only lost 5% of that slice of your pie, which is less than 5% probably of your overall pie. So, which is really manageable.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, that's really helpful, because I think a lot of people that is more doable. And I think somebody who has, and again, we're not giving any specific guidelines, but if somebody has a net worth of $1 million, this is going to look different than if they have a net worth of 10 million. And if they wanted to allocate 20 or 30 or 40% to these type of investments, then it's just something to think about. Because people, I think when they start out, I've realized, being an operator, a lot of people put the minimum, whatever a minimum is, if it's 50K or 100K, like 80% of people just put the minimum in, and then they just don't really think about that. So I think it is something important to think about. Now, previously, you mentioned something to me that as a full-time passive investor, you spend a lot of time on the phone or going to events, networking with other investors. And I think it's really important that anybody who wants to replace their income or grow their income passively pays attention to this. But can you talk to us about some of the reason for that, and some of the would you find deals that way, or do people tell you about sponsors, or what are things that you're kind of looking for through those networking?
Yeah, I don't know the percentage, but I spend honestly the vast majority of my workday networking. Because if you look at how I find the opportunities I'm investing in, because most of them are private, some of them are allowed to be publicly marketed, but still aren't even, but are just allowed to in their structure. Most of them are it's illegal for them to be publicly marketed. So the hardest part of my day is finding opportunities. And the way that happens is I network with other investors, other investor groups, and operators or sponsors. And I do it in many different ways. And I basically network as much as I can, because you never know how you're going to find an opportunity. You never know if one investor is going to say, hey, I just invested in this, you should check it out. I actually literally just sent an email to a couple of my friends today about something I just invested in. To me, this passive investing is a team sport. It's very difficult to do on your own. If you're not going to network, you're never going to find an opportunity. And that is actually one of the challenges associated with this type of investing, is it does take a lot of work to find the opportunities, except if you're going to go onto some crowdfunding websites or some sites where there's a lot of opportunities easily accessible. And then the trade-off is that you're then dealing with an intermediary where the return is going to be lower, because someone else is finding and vetting those opportunities instead of you finding them directly with the operator, and they're taking a portion of the profits, which if you're working in the corporate world may be worth it, because you may not have the time or the interest to network. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about this. But for someone like me who's doing it full-time, networking is the absolute key. And some of the stuff I found networking over the years has just been invaluable. I mean, obviously there's a value to everything, but I can't stress the importance of networking enough. It really just, you come up with a lot of interesting scenarios.
Yeah, it is really amazing. I mean, it's something that just going to meetups, and I know you've been involved in a lot of meetups in Southern California, and you go to national events as well. I go to a lot of local events. I lead a local event. I go to at least 10 conferences a year, and I meet really interesting people. And I think it's particularly important for people that are interested or are passively investing, because first of all, like you mentioned, you find out about the deals by meeting operators, you meet other passive investors. And I think that's just huge when you can meet other people that really are not selling you anything, right? It's not like you're meeting Fast Eddie from the car lot and you look great in that 1972 Buick. It's basically you're meeting somebody who's a neutral party. You just say, hey, I've done this, and this has been my experience. These are the operators I work with, and I've worked with them for 10 years, and I continue to work with them. That's a huge reference, right? When you start getting that in multiple places, you realize, oh, maybe this is the type of group I should be working with. So networking is really huge. So I know with your background, Jeremy, you've done a lot of different things in the corporate world. How did your corporate background help you and prepare you to become a passive investor?
Yeah, so for whatever reason, I've always had an interest in investing. I remember I was working at Disney headquarters back in 02 to 06, and this was just after the dot-com crash when just all the stuff was happening. And I was just watching CNBC every day, like just checking in every so often to make sure that everything was still intact, all that kind of thing. So I was always on top of the stuff. I always had an interest in it. So that interest was important, because I think I learned a lot along the way over the years of reading and looking at things, right? I think that from a job perspective, I would say that probably the most helpful thing I've had is more, I have an undergrad degree in business, and I have a master's in business as well, an MBA. And between the two, the understanding of, financials, accounting, spreadsheets, understanding IRRs and returns and ROIs and all the rest of it that is like the core foundation that's really helpful, so that I can actually jump into someone's underwriting or spreadsheet, take a look at their projections, their assumptions, and really be able to understand it. So the business background, I think, from a macro level, was important for me, because I was brand new to real estate investing in 2002, just like someone on this listening to this today may be brand new to it. And I had to go and learn from scratch, like everybody has to learn from scratch at some point, right? And so those basic tools of understanding the spreadsheets, understanding numbers well enough to be able to dig in something I don't really understand, it gave me a bit of a head start. But it's interesting, because honestly, I would tell you that I wouldn't say that too much on the job. I mean, look, doing business, networking with other people, all these things you're going to learn as you're having jobs and learning how the business world works, right? So that's very important, and as a core foundation you create. But I would say that the education I got throughout the years of going to some of these meetings we're talking about, and going to some of these conferences and listening to how people operate a property, or listening to panel people talk about different asset classes, that opened my eyes to a new asset class, being open to learning about new things. It's the continuing learning and education through the community, frankly, that really helped me to be able to get into all these different things that I learned about over time, right? I didn't learn any of that in class. I didn't learn any of that on the job. I learned all of it after in my investing world. So I think there's a lot of learning that has to go into this, and even on a continued basis, to kind of try to stay ahead of the curve. One of the most challenging things about these types of cash flow investments is that they're typically illiquid, unlike a stock, right? You can't go onto your screen and press sell like you could your Apple stock and get your money within 3 days. And so you have to think years ahead, because you're going to be in an illiquid, locked-in situation that is very hard to sell out of, that may have a 5 or 10 year or longer projected term. So staying on top of the news and what's going on in society, demographic shifts, the concept, for example, that people were aging, and that we knew people were aging and where they were going to retire, right? Florida, Texas, Arizona, all these southern hot states. This is pre-pandemic. This is just almost like thinking about it in your own mind logic. You can anticipate that years in advance if you did the research to know what was happening with the demographics in the US, right? So you're not necessarily going to hear about it in advance from somebody else. You're going to have to stay on top of it and think forward. So I get a lot of that through reading. I actually read a ton every day. I read probably 2 to 4, maybe 3 to 4 hours a day.
Wow.
Yeah, I would say I usually say 2 to 3 hours, but it's probably really 3 to 4 hours, just anytime I can, of news, business news, trends, everything else, just to try to stay ahead of everything, because that's really part of my job. I got to keep myself away from the landmines, essentially, but I have to think way ahead for that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of people that are leaders that I really respect, whether it's in the business world or just in philanthropy, other things, a lot of people, read 2-3 hours a day. And it's just amazing that, a lot of people, there's inequality when it comes to wealth. People have more money than other people, but everybody's got the same amount of time. So the fact that people that are very valuable people, even like yourself, that spend a lot of time reading, it's really, really important. And so, you look at the average CEO reads, I don't know if it's 50 to 100 books a year. There's quite a few books, they're reading, and not just books, but news and other things. It's really important. But I know for a lot of people kind of getting started in whether it's real estate investing or other types of passive investing, it can be a little intimidating. Can you maybe talk about some of the different benefits of, maybe different types of investing? So maybe it's tax benefits, or it's lower volatility or better returns in the stock market, just some things that maybe people that are more used to Wall Street could, kind of understand, whether it would be through syndicated real estate investments or other types of investments.
Yeah, sure. So look, you're talking to someone who specifically took a strategy to get out of the stock market after the dot-com crash. So this is very true to my heart, in that what I realized in doing an analysis on that stuff is 2 things. One is that I could probably reduce the volatility and increase the predictability of my returns long term, which is why I was really focused on this, is like, how do I increase the predictability of my long-term returns to understand where my retirement account is going to go in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and get away from all this crazy volatility. And 2 is I actually was surprised to see that the projected returns were significantly higher than the average historical long-term return of the stock market. Forget bonds, right? And so I was able to shift into all this stuff that theoretically is going to earn me substantially higher returns, projected theoretically, right? And reduce the volatility and increase the predictability. And I wasn't even looking for the higher returns. That was just a bonus. And so just to give you an idea, let's call the average historical long-term return of the stock market 7 to 8%. I hear both of those numbers quoted, right? right? Even if you call it 8, I would say that a lot of the stuff that I typically invest in is probably projecting. And of course, these are just projections, but they're each typically projecting somewhere between 12 and 15% average annualized return. Okay. And I think that's going to decrease over time because interest rates, in my opinion, are probably going to continue to go down over time. But even if you call it 10 to 12%, that's still significantly higher than the average long-term return of the stock market. And as far as some of the benefits you mentioned, I mean, that doesn't even count the tax benefits. So depreciation and expense flow through that goes against the income you're getting. So I know this is going to sound really weird for some people out there who aren't familiar with this type of investing, but if I invest in a apartment building as a random example, and I get $1,000 in cash flow from that apartment building this year, and it's my first year in that deal, very often I will either have to pay almost zero, or negative taxes on the $1,000 that I got. And the reason is because you get to deduct the expenses, including depreciation expense, from the income you got. And so what's really crazy is that often you could take that negative taxable income and offset it against other passive income you had from another opportunity that may not quite be as tax advantaged or maybe in a different structure, right? So there's a lot of benefits, tax benefits to investing in real estate. There's actually some non-real estate stuff I invest in, like ATM machines, where you can depreciate the machines 100% in year one. So if I invest $50,000 into that deal, I can deduct the $50,000 in the first year off of my passive income as a loss, because the government allows me to assume that the machines depreciate to zero right away. So forget whatever income I got, well, not forget, but including whatever income I got from that opportunity in the first year that I can deduct that depreciation against. I can then take the rest of that, which is a very significant piece, and deduct it against my passive income from other potential gains. Because the reality is, some other stuff I do, like single family loans for flippers, that's just regular income, ordinary income, right? So that can offset, because it's passive, that can also offset this type of income. I'm not an accountant, so consult with your accountant. I want to make sure I'm not saying anything wrong. This is my understanding, but there are a lot of different ways to end up, and that's something I really hate to say it, but if you're working in a full-time job and hearing this is kind of the beginning to you understanding about some people saying that the wealthier people pay lower taxes. I mean, these are some of the reasons, and it's the way the tax code's written. Nothing's illegal about it. It's just the way that the rules are written. Someone made them a long time ago, and we happen to benefit from them, the types of investments we're doing. So, right. It's good to learn about it if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, it is really interesting once you start learning about, you talked about higher returns. Obviously there's lower volatility, and then the tax benefits are incredible. And I have some friends that are entrepreneurs. I have one friend that, really makes almost $1 million a year, and he pays like ordinary income on this. So he's paying really high tax rates. And there are ways to lower tax, of course, on your investing side. There are actually certain types of investments that allow for ordinary income reduction, which they're kind of mostly in the energy space. There's some that do that, which are interesting, and there's different risk profiles involved with that. But it's amazing. We don't know what we don't know. And when I became what's called a real estate professional, even though I was working a job, I was doing more hours in real estate. I was able to qualify under the IRS designation as a real estate professional. So then I could actually write off ordinary income with some of these passive losses. Now, again, we're not giving you any advice on what you should do. It's just interesting, some of the different things that are out there if you're paying attention and you're learning. So one of the things I realized, I could make about 2/3 as much in income, but yet still make the same by paying less in taxes, which was pretty amazing. So there's different ways to be able to get there, which is pretty cool. Jeremy, what are some ways people can educate themselves more about whether it's real estate or some of these ways to reduce taxes or passive investing in general?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of ways. I mean, when I started in 2002, there were a few ways, or at least there were less ways. But with technology now, the internet, social media, there's a lot has come up, which is really great. So there's books that people can read. There's more books than ever about this type of investing. There's podcasts, which are one of my favorite methods, which, if you're working, you could do in the car on the way in, going home, whenever you have extra time, if you do. A lot of really great podcasts that exist that will have a ton of different speakers across different asset classes, and you can listen to someone who buys mobile home parks and someone who buys self-storage and all the rest of it, and hear how they do it and everything else. I mean, there's tens of thousands of episodes now across, that have been recorded the past few years in podcasts alone. There are crowdfunding websites that help to educate people on how these types of investments work. I think those are also good resources. You can go to in-person meetings like For Investors by Investors or Phoebe here in Southern California, but there's meetings all across the US where you have in-person investor meetings. I do want to caution you, just try not to go to any sales pitches. They're a very different philosophy and environment. You may not learn as much because you're going to be pitched books and tapes, but try to weed out based on comments or what you hear from other investors or feedback, or which are the ones that where they're pitching you, and then you're going to get some interesting and good education. There are actually courses you can take, online courses or in-person courses. Those are also, be very careful with those. Some are going to be much higher quality than others. Some of them are very expensive and overpriced. So I would caution you to really dig into those before you spend any money on them. But there are some good ones out there. There are in-person conferences, which can be extremely efficient. You can meet hundreds of investors in a day or two or three. Some of them might be local to you even. God, I'm probably missing some other things, honestly, but as you can see, there's just a ton of ways to get educated now.
Yeah, well, Jeremy, I really appreciate the value that you bring. Just want to honor you for you're such an abundance-minded person. You love helping other people, other investors, and you've given a lot of wealth today. And I just want to say thank you for that, as well as just the local meetups we've been involved with over the years. I appreciate all the value you're bringing to the real estate community. What's a way people can get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. Hopefully this is helpful for your listeners. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, don't hesitate. If you have questions, if I was any way I can help you, if you're new, if you want to network if you're an investor group, an investor, an operator, whatever, I'm happy to network or help anybody. So, or network with or help anybody. Best way to reach me is my email, which is jroll, JROLL @Roll Investments, ROLL Investments with an S.com. So jroll @rollinvestments.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much for doing the interview today. It's been a lot of fun, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on.
So as you can see from this interview, Jeremy is just an awesome guy who has really done it, right? If you're watching this video or listening to this podcast, you are basically someone who's interested in leaving your job with passive income, and Jeremy has done it. And he did it through starting small, learning, going to events. That's one of the number one things you can do, is just start going to events nationally, locally, asking questions, kicking tires, reading books, reading everything you can. Because when you meet people like Jeremy that have actually done what you hope to do, and that was really inspirational to me as I eventually left my job, which was a great corporate job making over $200K a year. I was able to do it by doing what he did, by learning, by starting small, by getting involved in investments, and then eventually my passive investments replaced my own expenses, which was amazing. And so there's different levels of financial freedom, but it is possible. It is something you can do if you do the work, you put the time in, and you go for it. So I hope this was encouraging to you. I'd love to hear back from you. Anything that you liked or you would like to hear about, you can reach out. You can shoot me an email at bronson@bronsonequity.com. I'd love to hear from you. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
You've been listening to the Mailbox Money Podcast. For more free resources, articles, and videos, go to bronsonequity.com. There you can download your copy of the special report, The Single Best Investment Strategy During and After a Pandemic. None of the information shared here is an offer to buy a specific investment, and this is for educational purposes only. Consult your financial, legal, and tax professionals and use your own common sense before making any investment decisions. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in next time for more Mailbox Money.